limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is more feasible than you think. We just need to go beyond for sustainability, accelerating the energy transition, deploying green tech at scale, decarbonizing entire value chains, and leave no one behind. Welcome to Beyond the Scope, a sustainability podcast that goes beyond the obvious in support of positive and collective climate action.
Hello, I'm Sumit Bose. Welcome to another edition of the Beyond the Scope podcast series with Schneider Electric. And today we're looking at something that is, I think, the most important thing: access to energy for all. There's about a staggering 2 billion people right now who have fundamental issues of having power, right? Whether it's on all the time, or they can have that power to give them clean water, give them the right food to be refrigerated, to function, to have offices and buildings working, from farmers right through to people working in very high-tech jobs. There still isn't that certainty around energy, which, if you live in the West, you find that quite hard to believe. But the recent situation, you can see how precarious power can be. So what can we do about that? What is Schneider doing in this world? How can we make sure that as we transition to green energy, we don't leave behind the people who are disconnected at present? We don't leave behind vast swathes of the developing nations. So to discuss that today, I'm joined by two experts, and I'm delighted to have Albert Fouché, who's a VP of Access to Energy at Schneider Electric. Albert, bonjour.
Bonjour, good evening to all of you.
And also Ajay Shah, who's the founder of Frontier Market, based in India, I think. Is that correct?
Yes. Hi, Sumit. Hi, everyone. That is correct.
Right. Let's just give a little background, guys, to both of you. Just explain a little bit about what access to energy means, Albert, and what your role is at Schneider.
Thank you, Sumit. Yes, with pleasure. So access to energy at Schneider Electric is a social business. It means that we work at cost. We don't make profit out of this business. It's a social engagement as part of the sustainable development of the company. So we are actually aiming to connect 100 million people by 2030, 50 million people by 2025. To date, we have connected 35 million people. The current pace is 5 million, 6 million per year. So this is what we are doing, and I will explain later on how do we do this.
And Ajay, Frontier Market, can you explain what that is?
Sure. So Frontier Markets, because we work in multiple regions in India and globally in general in terms of our work, is a social business that started off in India with a mission to essentially bridge the gap of getting rural people that live in remote villages access to high impact quality products and services that they otherwise aren't being able to reach. So in the context of India, there are over 700,000 villages in the country with over 800 million people living there. And unfortunately, where these rural families live, that are usually agri families and primarily 51% women, they're not living in locations where they have access to viable electrification, quality healthcare, low-cost financing, digital services, etc. And the challenge that we see is that when you deprive people of access to quality services, you're preventing their ability to climb the ladder of economic empowerment. So today, Frontier Markets addresses that in three ways. One is we have built our own supply chain, which reaches really the last remote village in India, doorstep delivery of aggregated products and services that we work with various different suppliers, whether it's in clean energy, whether it's consumer durables, whether it's essential services, digital payments, healthcare, agri. But we also, to reach that rural customer, invest in rural women, entrepreneurs. We believe that by creating entrepreneurial opportunities in the villages where we operate, we're helping women get viable access to income, but also become the bridge to connect us to rural customers. And lastly, we do this all through a technology platform. So we've created our own in-house assisted commerce solution called the Meri Saheli app, which our rural women are using to help millions of customers get online and share their data, share their information to help us understand how to navigate the right products and services at scale. Today, we have 30,000 women entrepreneurs. We have over 1 million rural families that we work with in India across 2 states of the country. And we've helped sell over 20 million solutions on the ground, really trying to connect people with the right products and services at the right time to help address their life challenges.
What do you mean by the right products and services? Are we talking about devices? Are we talking about a way to sell crops? What sort of things?
So the way that we look at this is that a rural family that lives in a village needs access to everything. Given the geography that they live in, unfortunately, the closest store or the closest service provider is still at least 5 to 20 to 30 kilometers away. So for them to be able to get even a quality solar lantern or get access to a cell phone or be able to make payments online or get access to financial services, it's always a very high cost because they're not actually being able to get these services where they live. But also on the other side, these amazing solutions providers, whether they're in healthcare, they're in agriculture, they're in essential services, they're in clean energy solutions. I'm sure Albert can talk a little bit about this, but if even amazing companies like Schneider, just because of the lack of connection to the rural customer directly where they live, it's very difficult to really reach that rural customer at scale and bring those products and services to that where that rural customer lives, but also defining what does that rural farmer actually need? Do they need a solar pump? Do they need a home lighting system? So what Frontier Markets does is that we're able to bridge that gap. Through our network of women, we're able to truly understand who this rural customer is. What are their pain points? Is it that they need basic lighting? Is it that they need a refrigerator? Is it that they need access to appliances? We're able to use data to truly understand where the pain points are. And then we would work with companies like Schneider's of the world and help them kind of design the right products. And we would then deliver those services to where the rural customer lives.
Yeah, I will obviously agree with that, and just would like to add the fact that the channel is everything. And what Ajahita was mentioning is all about the capacity of providers to reach the customer in regions where it's not easy because the density of business is quite low, distance are quite important. So there are plenty of very smart and agile entrepreneurs everywhere. So when you reach a region and people are not connected to electricity or energy, it means that there is an issue with the traditional model. And this is what companies like Ajahita or others are trying to do, is to bridge this gap and to boost the missing brick between the consumer and potential providers of products or services.
Yeah, this is all very interesting. The question is, how do you take rural communities and bring them into a digital age? Because it involves infrastructure. It also involves education. So let's just discuss that. What are the challenges in trying to do this?
So I think in the context of India, there's been a big shift in the last 5 to 7 years, given government policies and investments in rural India in itself. So today, we can say that the biggest gap of digitization in India earlier would have been lack of internet connectivity. But actually today, almost 85% of villages have 4G internet connectivity, which has been a game changer. Secondly, if you look at road connectivity, actually you have much better pathways or access to rural villages just by that simple connectivity. There has been efforts in some levels of infrastructure electrification, but again, going to the household level, it's just not there in the same level. But smartphone penetration also has increased drastically. Today, almost 1 out of every household, there's at least one smartphone that is in that household itself. So the job that Frontier Markets ultimately then has is to be able to use its network of women entrepreneurs. We do believe it's about assisted. You need somebody on the ground in these villages who is getting trained, educated, and given skills to be able to become that facilitator or that liaison that helps the other rural families get online. So our Sahelis, these women entrepreneurs, are getting trained by Frontier Markets. We're recruiting them from the villages where they live. We're giving them access to smartphones. We're giving them internet connectivity. We've created a e-commerce or assisted commerce platform, which is local, vernacular, AI enabled. It's actually designed for a digitally illiterate person. to be able to use well and help others get connected online. So Sumit, you're right. I mean, it's not a simple task. There's a high investment in campaigning, marketing, education, skilling. But because India does have a massive shift with digital connectivity, it's a huge opportunity today to try to get as many people online and then leverage the ability of online understanding through data to then be able to start bridging the gaps in terms of product market fit.
That explains a lot. Why is Schneider doing this? Why are you getting involved in this sort of thing? Because obviously you could say there are plenty of markets for you guys to look at. Why does this matter to your organization?
When you are a successful multinational specialized on sustainability, you cannot look elsewhere when you see 800 million people not connected to electricity and 1 billion not connected to clean cooking, and another 1 billion connected to poor or unreliable grid. It's part of the DNA of the company. When we were building the strategy of access to energy, we identified 3 pillars. The first one is access to technology, and what Ajayita was mentioning is exactly that. That digitization is the best enabler for efficiency. So technology came, cost reduced, and now you have renewable cheaper than traditional fuels. The second pillar is access to education, because technology is nothing if you don't have people enabled to operate it. So access to education means a huge educational program, partnerships with educational bodies, with local stakeholders, local experts, and training and preparing the future entrepreneurs will carry on all these new technology. And the third pillar is access to finance. So Schneider has created several impact funds, one for Africa, one for Asia, and we are helping startup companies in order to develop their business. So as soon as you have education, technology, and finance, you have a much better chance to bridge this gap that I was mentioning before.
We look at where we are now, current crisis, war, it's not a crisis, war in Ukraine, and the ramifications for global energy. And some would say this has caused a problem for renewable energy because everywhere around the world, the UK government has just done it, everywhere's doing it. There's a bit of a return to oil and gas. How does this current crisis affect the transition? Because, as you say, the cheaper energy for village communities would be to have more renewable, to have more solar. But there's a cost implication here right now of what's going on. So what do you both think about that?
Of course, the positive aspect is that if you have choice, if you are in a rich country and you have choice, the return on investment of renewables will be better because the price of renewable has increased less than the one of fossil energy. But as we are talking access to energy, this crisis makes things much more difficult for people who were already struggling to get access to energy because the cost inflation has been impacting all components, including for renewables. So I see it as a threat. I see it as an additional problem, but this crisis will pass. And after this crisis, we will still have all these people to be connected to the grid. So it's just a matter of delay and trying to find solutions to have more integrated solutions and as well to speed up the transition because there is no really choice. Electricity is the most efficient way to get energy. So, and renewable is the only one sustainable because we have an energy crisis, we have a climate crisis. So renewable is definitively not an option, including for access to energy segment.
Samita, I'll add to that. I'll look at this with everything that Albert said, I agree with, but there's one call to action that I believe is starting to come in the industry, which is that we understand that in most, especially energy impoverished places, right, like extreme poverty areas, we have to stop waiting for a sustainable market-based solution to address the crisis of not having access to any sort of power or systems to be able to address the challenges. And so you're seeing more and more efforts and looking at where the role of philanthropy and blended capital can come in, where you're starting to really just cover that, Albert, to your point, that inflation cost and actually understand that things like subsidies or things like grants are not a bad thing if you're really trying to address the problem directly at hand, because the need is just so critical if we think about how many people are being left behind just by not having basic access to energy. So that's number one. I think the second thing that I would say is that the irony of the war is that in countries like India, because the prices of gas and oil actually fluctuating so significantly, there actually has been a larger movement of wanting to invest in renewables more aggressively to actually not be captive to the changing prices of oil and gas, given the uncertainties of what's happening in our political ecosystems globally, which I think is an interesting opportunity for us to start understanding how we, again, push this more effectively and think about that integration that Albert's referring to. And third thing that I'll say, and Albert, you alluded to this, which is that, renewable energy really is one of the number one pillars to address the climate change challenge. Having been spent the entire week in New York for Climate Week this week, it's been interesting to understand that at the end of the day, climate is not just a technology challenge, it's a people problem. And if we start understanding the role that renewables can play in replacing people's practices of consumption, the carbon emission reduction that renewables play is so significant that actually could be very game-changing in terms of addressing our climate challenge as well. If you think about the point that Albert made about the fact that there's over 1 billion people today that are still using cook stoves that are creating massive carbon challenges, replacing that with renewable solutions really reduces your carbon footprint and actually allows us to really start showing the role that renewables can play in terms of denting a shift in the world that will be overall better for everyone. And I think the goal ideally here should be is that energy access is not just about getting solutions to poor people. It's about understanding that the poor people that don't have access to solutions are billions who can play a massive role as a champions of change to make the entire ecosystem shift in a different way.
If we look at it globally, there are so many different communities, and you've touched on that this could affect. What would you both say is the solution? Because it's very tricky, isn't it? In some places, you might need solar PV, you might need wind. You've got to have an ability for these communities to be A, contacted, B, worked with, C, to find the right solution, and then the finance of it. So what does it need to get this? Does this need governments to get involved? Or is this really about kind of the generosity of private sector organizations and not-for-profits like yourselves to get together? Where do we see this if we really want to address this? Because it's not as easy as saying, hey, here's a couple of solar panels, you'll be fine.
I can jump in first, just really fairly quickly, Sumit. So first of all, I think it's not one or the other, right? I think it's an ecosystem of different players. We are a for-profit social business that works with all kinds of private sector players, but we also work with nonprofits on the ground to reach to the communities to actually understand how to get to these villages in the first place. But then at the same time, thanks to certain government policies in India, the solar mission, for example, there has been a larger effort to really look at wanting to encourage investments in the renewable space. So I think it's a matter of understanding all the different people that need to come together on this on the same table and design together, right? So, I can give you a very simple customer journey for everyone in the audience, right? Here's a village in some part of Rajasthan where there are people that do not have access to anything. Now, how do you decide what the solution is? You need to first understand who they are and what their problems are, what their challenges are. You bring in a local community partner, like a nonprofit, and you're giving them those skills and that technology to be able to get that information. That information is not going to be used by that nonprofit. Ideally, that information is being shared with solutions providers. And there could be multiple solutions providers. Those multiple solutions providers, if they have the right information, can actually design the right solution. But then you need a channel partner like a Frontier Markets to actually then be able to package it, test it, deliver it, and create adoptions. With government policy supporting you, you can bring in subsidies, but then of course you can also bring in access to finance. And then when you bring in players like impact investors or larger corporates like Schneider, you have a larger financing ecosystem that actually brings the entire thing together to demonstrate an economies of scale. And I think that's really, if we start thinking about it that way, it's not, at least for people like Albert and I who've been doing this for quite a long time, it's not as complicated as you want to make it out to be. It's just a matter of making sure that the right people are in the room at the right time, listening to each other, and actually coming up with a collective solution on the value chain to make this work, is my perspective.
Albert, when you choose somewhere to support, how do you go about doing that then?
I would say we always try to scale up. When you are a multinational, you are not an NGO. We are here to scale up because this is what we are good at. And the starting point is certainly a national integrated energy plan, which is shared with all stakeholders, raising trust toward the full ecosystem, influenced by a strong regulation, standardization, and so on. And once your local stakeholders will be properly organized and communicating externally, then international bodies will come and will support eventually with partnership between private and public. So to answer your question, when we choose a targeted country or region, we always look at the risk to fail and the probability to be able to connect millions of people, because this is the final goal. Schneider is committed to connect 100 million people. So obviously we are doing as well small projects because it's always good to learn, and we are testing some models, some innovation. We are trying new solutions. But for the mainstream, we are trying to scale. And to scale, you need to come back to the country of the region, check what about your three pillars, finance, education, and technology, and see where is the lower risk to fail, and then we go with everything.
Before we go, we're almost at the end. Let's talk about what's happening now. And one thing you said, Ajita, which I think was very interesting about women, okay? And globally, this issue of kind of how you bring a community on board. We're seeing more and more of this where people are saying we need to target the women in a community. Why is that so important?
I obviously have a very strong opinion about saying that this is the new age for women to become the leaders of change. And, in the context of energy access and the context of climate, the fundamental reality is that women are at the center of the energy poverty crisis, right? They are the ones that are responsible for cooking. They're the ones that are responsible for taking care of their families. They're the ones that are responsible for even managing their household finances and thinking about how to constantly uplift their families to get out of poverty. And they really are the ones that care about this, frankly speaking, more than anybody else, if you look at the entire foray of dynamics around people. And women are ready to be invested in, to get the right skills and become those leaders and those change makers. And we're seeing that globally. More and more, you're seeing businesses really invest in creating women entrepreneurs and skilling women and giving them the digital access and giving them the opportunities to become that liaison, to educate people, to get them onboarded, to help them in terms of the behavior change journey. And it's been working quite well, right? I mean, what we're seeing is that in order to have people really be a part of this energy transition, it does take a lot of education, trust, and it takes a lot of handholding. And women are very good at that. And they're hungry to earn income, and they're hungry to be leaders in their areas of operations. And so in India, we're seeing a massive movement. We ourselves are making a commitment of creating 1 million of these women entrepreneurs across the country to reach 100 million people in the next 3 to 5 years, because we believe that the central role that women can play in the energy transition is critical. The last thing I'll say is that also understand that women are also, if they adopt renewable energy as farmers or as consumers, again, it's game changing when you look at this in the climate lens. And so that's why you're more and more seeing people recognizing that women need to be a part of this discussion, invested in, and really be the drivers of change.
Of course, I agree with all what was said. The biggest challenge seen by us in energy management and automation is to convince or to find women to step into the career of electricians or technicians or automation. But once they are on board, they perform extremely well. And the results are outstanding because the capacity to convince, the capacity to implement is obviously very high. And they are extremely legitimate because what Ajaita was mentioning, they spend most of their time, they lose their time looking for non-added value tasks, while once they get energy, once they get proper tools, then they can focus on high added value tasks, including some small business and so on. So no, definitely inside Schneider, it's obviously we are looking for the parity. We are not yet at parity in terms of headcounts at Schneider, but it's because of what I was mentioning, it's harder to find women with embracing these careers. But we are evolving quite nicely.
No, I remember going on a trip with Schneider to Sao Paulo and seeing exactly that, how you're training some electricians in one of the favelas. It was good fun, so I won't forget that one. Before we go, COP27 on its way. What are your hopes on this? Because, we've got the climate change issue, which is one, but this access to energy, access to stable energy has been around for decades and decades, and it never seems to really be addressed. You get pockets of flying forward and, oh yes, this village is doing well and that's doing that. But we all know that globally, there's still this huge disparity. What do you both hope about this issue, about access to energy, if anything is addressed at COP? Ajay, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you can imagine that this week, that's been the elephant in the room, that the renewable energy and the energy access space, we've all been fighters about this for almost 2 decades now. And yet at every COP, it's never the center of discussion. It's always sidelined. The biggest thing that we're hoping for in COP27 this year is that how do we ensure that we understand that in order to make a dent in climate, you have to focus on energy access and renewable. And so really, there's a larger group, I think, really setting up now, especially given that COP this year is going to be in Egypt. And of course, it's going to be centered around Africa, that we can actually really come with a very strong continent-wide plan around really being able to show that what would investment in energy access to the last mile in even 10 countries of Africa show as a dent for carbon emission savings and climate, such that we're able to start getting the attention of the folks that are at COP to see that the renewable energy and energy access space is critical, essential as a forefront discussion point if we want to be doing anything successful in the next 5 years when it comes to climate.
Look, we think it's not an option, even if it's tough, even if a normal business model doesn't apply. You cannot leave these people on the side of the road. Access to energy is a fundamental right to all of us, and we are working on it. And there is a deep shift within the society, within these big companies which are now committed to be net zero carbon emission, to be sustainable and so on. So when you have the chance to work at such a company, you have the tools, because it's not anymore philanthropy, which by nature is always limited to the budget. It's social business, which means that you don't make profit, but you don't lose money. And when you have available technology, when you have a clear frame, integrated energy plan defined, when you can generate higher trust, you will decrease the cost of money for finance body and so on. If you don't forget the social aspect, which means let's listen, let's understand why these people are not yet connected, and let's not deploy our international solutions which will fail. If you understand why all these microgrids installed in Africa after 4 years are not working anymore, you can increase the success rate, and at the end it will work. So the hope of the team, of the company, is really to be more and more accurate, to be more and more social business driven, which is quite new for us. It's just a decade, it's nothing. And to be successful deploying this solution, most of them through local partners, because local entrepreneurs are the best vehicle to convey all these solutions of progress.
That's a good point and a positive point to end with. Albert Fouché and Ajay Shah, thanks so much for joining me on this episode of the Beyond the Scope podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope it's been a stimulating conversation.
This has been Beyond the Scope, a sustainability podcast brought to you by Schneider Electric and supported by its Sustainability Research Institute. If you liked this episode, you can listen, subscribe, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts for more. The content of this podcast is for information purposes only and should not be undertaken as financial, economic, legal, business, tax, or investment advice. The information, statements, views, and opinions should not be construed as the provision of advice by Schneider Electric or as an offer to buy or sell any products or services or to make or consider any investment or course of action.